What if I told you that the mighty Roman legions, the most feared fighting force of the ancient world, were brought to their knees by tactics they never saw coming? You might think that Rome's enemies were nothing more than disorganized tribes, but the truth is far more shocking. The so-called barbarians didn't just challenge the empire, they redefined the art of war. From ambushes in dense forests to swift cavalry raids, these warriors used their knowledge of terrain and unconventional strategies to outmaneuver Rome's disciplined legions. How did they do it? What tactics allowed these tribes to stand up to the greatest military power of their time? Today, we're diving deep into the innovative military tactics that left Roman generals scrambling for answers. Get ready to uncover how the enemies of Rome rewrote the rules of war and forced the empire to rethink everything they knew about combat. Stay tuned, because what you're about to discover will change your understanding of warfare forever. At the height of its power, the Roman Empire stood as an unparalleled military machine, boasting the most disciplined, well-trained army the ancient world had ever seen. The legions were a formidable force, with standardized formations, highly advanced engineering, and a rigorous command structure that struck fear into the hearts of their enemies. But as invincible as Rome appeared, this very confidence became one of its greatest weaknesses. The legions, accustomed to fighting enemies on familiar terms, were caught off guard by the unexpected. The Romans were masters of siege warfare, open-field battles, and disciplined infantry combat, but when faced with unconventional strategies, they often faltered. One of the critical flaws in Roman strategy was their reliance on rigid formations and predictable tactics. This rigidity made them highly effective in straightforward combat, but ill-prepared for enemies who didn't play by the same rules. Barbarian forces, often seen by the Romans as disorganized and chaotic, turned their adaptability into a deadly weapon. They didn't adhere to the same formalities of war that the Romans expected, and their guerrilla tactics, ambushes, and swift retreats disrupted the slow, calculated movements of Roman forces. The belief that their enemies were inferior led to many Roman generals underestimating the true threat posed by these barbarian warriors. As Roman armies expanded across Europe, they encountered tribes and peoples who had lived and fought on these lands for centuries. These groups had intimate knowledge of the terrain and were masters of using their environment to their advantage. Roman overconfidence and their unfamiliarity with the harsh and varied landscapes they were venturing into gave their enemies a clear advantage. The forests, mountains, and rivers that the Romans saw as obstacles became the staging grounds for deadly ambushes, where the disciplined legions found themselves vulnerable. The arrogance of assuming their military superiority would always prevail blinded them to the necessity of adapting to these new forms of warfare. In battles like the infamous Teutoburg forest ambush, where an entire Roman force was decimated by Germanic tribes, the legions were exposed for their inability to respond to surprise attacks in difficult terrain. The dense forests neutralized the Romans' advantage in open field formations and cavalry maneuvers, leaving them disoriented and at the mercy of their attackers. Such defeats revealed cracks in the Roman military doctrine, showing that their tactics, while formidable in some situations, were far from invincible. The very systems that made Rome dominant also made it predictable and, in the face of innovative barbarian strategies, vulnerable. What the Romans perceived as disorganization among barbarian forces was, in fact, a flexible and adaptive approach to warfare that countered the strict discipline of the legions. Their overconfidence led them to believe they could impose their form of warfare on any enemy in any environment. However, as their foes became more adept at exploiting Roman weaknesses, this arrogance became a deadly flaw. Roman commanders, slow to recognize the changing nature of their enemies' tactics, found themselves facing not just isolated skirmishes, but a methodical redefinition of warfare itself. The barbarian tribes, often seen by the Romans as primitive and unsophisticated, held one major advantage that the legions could not easily counter: a deep understanding of their native landscapes. From the dense forests of Germania to the rugged hills of Britannia, these warriors used their environment as a weapon, turning natural obstacles into strategic advantages. Unlike the Romans, who relied heavily on open-field battles and fortified camps, the barbarian forces thrived in environments that were unfamiliar and hostile to the disciplined ranks of legionaries. Ambushes became their weapon of choice, striking fast and disappearing into the wilderness before the Romans could regroup. These ambush tactics were devastating because they preyed on the Roman army's biggest weaknesses: their predictability and slow response time in unfamiliar terrain. Roman armies, marching in long, cumbersome columns, were ideal targets for sudden attacks from the cover of trees or hills. Barbarian warriors, often fighting in smaller, mobile groups, would strike at the flanks or rear of Roman columns, causing confusion and panic. Before the Romans could organize a counterattack, the enemy would vanish, using the terrain to melt back into the shadows. These hit-and-run tactics were not only physically damaging, but also psychologically demoralizing for the Roman troops. The element of surprise was crucial. Barbarian forces would often lure Roman legions into narrow passes, valleys, or forested areas where the terrain severely limited the effectiveness of Roman formations. Once the legions were confined, their strength in disciplined, large-scale maneuvers was neutralized, and they became easy prey for the waiting ambush forces. The surprise attacks shattered the morale and discipline of the Roman troops, as they found themselves fighting an enemy who seemed to appear out of nowhere. For the Roman commanders, it became increasingly difficult to anticipate where and when these attacks would occur, further eroding their confidence in their ability to control the battlefield. One of the most famous examples of this tactic is the ambush in the Teutoburg forest in 9 AD, where Germanic tribes under Arminius annihilated 3 Roman legions. The Romans, marching through dense woods and narrow trails, were unable to deploy their troops effectively and were systematically slaughtered by smaller, more agile forces. The defeat sent shockwaves through Rome, not only because of the sheer loss of life, but because it exposed the empire's vulnerability when confronted with enemies who refused to engage in traditional face-to-face battle. It was a stark reminder that Roman military supremacy could be undone by enemies who knew how to use the environment against them. Barbarian tribes excelled in turning their knowledge of local terrain into a deadly tool of war. By leveraging their intimate connection to the forests, hills, and rivers of their homeland, they transformed these natural features into the perfect staging grounds for ambushes. The Romans, unused to fighting in such conditions, were repeatedly caught off guard. These ambushes weren't just spontaneous attacks. They were meticulously planned operations that exploited Roman vulnerabilities. For the legions, every march into barbarian territory became a gamble, where the rules of engagement were no longer set by Roman generals, but by the unseen enemy waiting in the shadows. While Roman legions were known for their formidable infantry, the barbarian forces often relied on cavalry for swift and decisive attacks. These mounted warriors brought a level of mobility and flexibility that the Roman military structure struggled to counter effectively. In battles where speed and adaptability were key, barbarian cavalry forces could strike with incredible precision, exploiting the slow, methodical movements of the Roman legions. What the Romans saw as brute force in the barbarian armies was often the result of carefully executed strategies, with cavalry playing a pivotal role in the chaos that would follow. The cavalry's ability to outmaneuver Roman infantry formations gave the barbarians a significant edge. Roman legions were designed for close combat, relying on tightly organized ranks to hold the line. In contrast, barbarian cavalry could quickly strike at the flanks, break through weak points, and retreat before the Romans could mount a defense. This constant harassment wore down the discipline of the legions, making them more vulnerable to larger assaults. It was not uncommon for barbarian cavalry to be used in conjunction with infantry ambushes, further disorienting Roman forces and preventing them from establishing effective battle lines. Unlike the Roman cavalry, which was typically used to support the infantry in a defensive capacity, barbarian cavalry units often formed the backbone of their armies. These warriors fought with ferocity, but their real strength lay in their ability to adapt. Cavalry units could easily traverse difficult terrain, setting traps for the advancing legions, and then using their speed to deliver devastating charges. Whether fighting in the open plains or dense forests, these riders turned the tide of many battles. Their ability to strike quickly and retreat to safety gave the barbarians a psychological advantage, keeping Roman forces perpetually on the defensive. One of the most prominent examples of effective barbarian cavalry tactics came during the Gothic War, where the Goths repeatedly used cavalry to outmaneuver Roman armies. In these encounters, Roman commanders found themselves unable to pin down their enemies, who seemed to appear from nowhere and disappear just as swiftly. The Goths, among other barbarian groups, understood that striking at the right moment was more important than sustaining prolonged engagements. This strategy contrasted sharply with Roman doctrines, which emphasized endurance and the slow grinding down of the enemy over time. For the Romans, who prided themselves on discipline and control, this form of warfare was deeply unsettling. Barbarian cavalry didn't just offer a tactical advantage. It represented a philosophical shift in how war was waged. It was a style of combat that prioritized flexibility, surprise, and rapid assaults, which often left Roman commanders scrambling to respond. These hit-and-run tactics left little room for the Romans to adapt, as they were conditioned to fight enemies who adhered to more traditional forms of warfare. Over time, the growing prominence of cavalry among barbarian forces pushed Rome to rethink its own military strategies, forcing the empire to adopt new methods to cope with an increasingly mobile and elusive enemy. The relentless pressure from barbarian forces eventually shattered the long-held belief in the invincibility of the Roman legions. What had once been seen as an unstoppable war machine now faced enemies who had not only adapted to Rome's strengths, but actively exploited its weaknesses. Barbarian armies, far from being disorganized hordes, were tactically astute and quick to identify the vulnerabilities in Roman strategies. Over time, these enemies honed their skills, and the cumulative effect of repeated defeats forced Rome into a position it had rarely experienced, one of adaptation, not domination. One of the key areas where Roman tactics had to evolve was in the defensive structures of their military campaigns. As barbarian incursions became more frequent, Roman generals began shifting from offensive conquest to fortification and defense. The construction of fortified outposts, walls, and forts became a priority in regions where barbarian threats loomed large. The famed limes, frontier boundaries fortified with walls and garrisons, were a direct response to the growing barbarian threat. Rather than extending their borders further, the Romans sought to protect what they already held, a drastic shift in a previously expansionist empire. Another major change in Roman military doctrine was the incorporation of barbarian tactics into their own strategies. As the legions faced more cavalry assaults and ambushes, they began integrating barbarian-style cavalry units into their forces. The auxiliary troops, many of whom were recruited from barbarian tribes themselves, became essential for countering the same tactics that had once been so effective against Rome. Roman generals, acknowledging the need for greater flexibility, also started employing smaller, more mobile units to counter the fast-moving barbarian forces. This shift in Roman military thought was an acknowledgement that their traditional methods were no longer sufficient. Despite these adaptations, the psychological blow to Rome's military pride was severe. The legions, once the symbol of Roman supremacy, now faced battles where victory was uncertain and defeat was a very real possibility. The barbarians, once dismissed as inferior, had proven themselves to be formidable enemies capable of standing toe-to-toe with Rome's finest. These defeats were not just physical, but also symbolic, as the very idea of Roman dominance was shaken. The empire, which had always prided itself on the discipline and superiority of its forces, now had to confront the reality that its enemies had become their equals in both strategy and strength. Rome's shift in tactics was a testament to the adaptability of the empire, but it also marked the beginning of the end of its dominance. The barbarians had forced the Romans to fight on their terms, not through overwhelming force, but by systematically undermining the strengths of the legions. As the centuries wore on, these barbarian forces would continue to challenge and ultimately break the Roman grip on Europe. The once mighty legions, though still powerful, had been humbled. The barbarians had not just fought Rome, they had redefined the very nature of war.